You're listening to Uncovering Dark Falls, the top-rated show in local legends, town gossip, and unexplained disappearances, I guess. Some of you thought I was disappeared for a month, but I wasn't. I was just interviewing for jobs, man. It's all good. Hopefully I find something soon. But hey, in the meantime, let's talk about something weird. There's a famous quote from the well-known American pianist Oscar Levant, and it goes, "There's a thin line between genius and insanity, and I have erased this line." I've come across several similar quotes over the years because numerous people have often acknowledged the thin line that lies between genius and insanity. It's a pretty common occurrence, I guess. Now, another parallel quote that comes to mind was made by contemporary American author Elise Kova, who said, "There is a fine line between genius and madness." Now, I'm sure you're wondering why I'm popping off with quotes about genius and madness and insanity. Well, to tell you the truth, hold on. Excuse you. I began remembering these quotes when I came across the once fabled works of a genius Dark Falls botanist named Dr. Michael Brewer. My investigation into Dr. Brewer has revealed things to me that my mind still cannot comprehend. It's also made me wonder if this man was actually a genius, or if all of the experiments he carried out in his basement were simply the result of madness and obsession. I started looking into the case of Dr. Brewer when I came across some experimental logs and research records. They were supposedly penned by Dr. Brewer's research assistant in 1963. Now, these records told a bewildering story of the bizarre events that occurred in Dr. Brewer's basement from the 4th of April in 1963 to the 9th of May of the same year. Some parts of the documents had been destroyed, but I was still able to piece together what remained from the surviving pages. Now, the details of the first experiment log, which were written on the 4th of April, 1963, are as follows. April 4, 1963, 9:02 p.m. Experiment ID A-001. Title, Botanical Physiology and Cellular Fusion. Trial, Stage 1. The objective is assessing the viability of Dr. Brewer's theories under controlled conditions and applied experimentation. This is the entry on Research Day 1. Dr. Brewer has begun carrying out personal experiments in his basement after his unfortunate firing. I believe our boss's decision to let him go was a terrible mistake, because Dr. Brewer was a true genius in addition to being the best specialized botanist on this side of the world. I'd looked up to him for most of my life, and words can't explain the honor that I felt when he asked me to join him in his new endeavors. Ever since he'd been let go, Dr. Brewer was finally able to bring his brilliant ideas to life with no restrictions, and together we were diving into spheres of science and botany that could boggle the mind. I truly believed these experiments would be Dr. Brewer's legacy, and after what we accomplished in his basement, I knew without a doubt that the world would never forget the name Michael Brewer. Stage 1 had gone much better than expected, as our plant specimens were developing at a rapid rate. However, there were a few hiccups due to Dr. Brewer's kids, Casey and Margaret. This was one of the many downsides of having to carry out our experiments in Dr. Brewer's basement, as the kids were a never-ending distraction. Earlier today, after we just made several breakthroughs, the two kids, who were playing outside with their frisbee, asked Dr. Brewer to join them. Dr. Brewer rejected their invitation, as some of the specimens that we were monitoring had grown 3 times in size and had begun to move. So he told them he had to stay put and monitor his experiments in the basement. Now, I knew that Dr. Brewer loved his kids, but the work that we were doing required everything we had, and many sacrifices needed to be made if we were going to see this through. As we continued our research and experiments in the basement, the children grew even more curious. There was an unforeseen accident during one of our tests, and Dr. Brewer's hand was cut, leaving a deep wound. It was at this point that both Casey and Margaret came down to see the experiments that their father had been spending so much time on, but instead, they saw blood gushing from Dr. Brewer's injury, and he yelled at them once again to stay out of the basement. Dr. Brewer cleaned and stitched the wound before getting back to work. We were able to run several experiments before the sudden departure of Dr. Brewer's wife to Tucson later that afternoon, where she was visiting her hospitalized sister, Eleanor, who had been sick for some time. Dr. Brewer had to drive his wife to the airport so that she could catch her flight, but this only made matters worse with their children's intrusions. After they'd gone, Casey, Margaret, and their visiting friend named Diane waited until I'd left before sneaking back into the basement to get a closer look at their father's work. The three kids came in contact with a few of our plant specimens, which had by then become abnormally large and begun to produce, peculiar fruits with unusually complex seeds. These plants had also undergone significant structural changes, particularly in leaf size and in pigmentation. Some of the vivid green leaves had extended into 20-inch tendrils, and they were now emitting a faint phosphorescent glow. These changes had significantly increased the ambient moisture, effectively turning the basement oppressively humid and making it difficult to study the plants for an extended period without proper equipment. I managed to regulate these conditions by utilizing both thermohydrometers and chilled mirror hydrometers for constant monitoring. I'd also carried out further examination using CTH chambers and mechanical desiccators. Before I left, I'd also noticed something strange during my tests, as these particular plant specimens had begun to exhibit characteristics similar to mammalian respiration. It was faint, but they emitted these bizarre, rhythmic sounds eerily reminiscent of the way a mammal breathes in and out through its nose. I studied the sounds further to be certain, and there was no doubt about it. I could clearly hear them breathing from where I stood. In addition to that, the specimens were moving a lot more frequently, and it seemed their tendrils had gained a mind of their own, as they'd begun to gesture and lure nearby subjects toward them. The plant's disturbing new traits had frightened the children, and they quickly left the basement around the time Dr. Brewer pulled back into the driveway. However, Casey, who'd been affected by the basement's humidity, had taken off his sweatshirt due to the oppressive temperature, and he'd accidentally left it there next to the plants. He rushed back to get it before I or his father could see it. Unfortunately, Dr. Brewer's son, Casey, had gotten too close and was attacked and trapped in the long tendrils of one of our specimens. The boy had to be rescued by his sister, who somehow managed to free him. They attempted to leave quickly using the stairs, but their father had already witnessed everything while standing at the basement doorway. Dr. Brewer relayed all of this to me when I arrived later that evening, and we decided it was best if he spoke to the kids again so that we could avoid their interference with our experiments from now on. So he sat down both of his children at the kitchen table and assured them that he would reveal everything about his experiments when the time was right. He then told them that until that time came, they were never to go into the basement again, as it was now a prohibited area. We'd hoped that banning them from the basement had made things crystal clear and that there would be no more meddling from either of them. Stage 1 was already a success, even with the slight obstructions from Dr. Brewer's kids. We were already drafting out plans for our next steps, and we couldn't afford any distractions as we were taking our experiments to a different level in Stage 2. Signed, S. Knight, Research Assistant, and reviewed by Dr. Michael Brewer. That was the log that was recorded. Now, all of that was the end of Knight's first research entry, and before we move on to the next one, there are a few things that I would like to clear up. The words in the record that I just narrated are, how do I put this? The dumbed-down version, or should I say my interpretations of the notes and entries that Knight had penned down. The actual document was much lengthier, as it contained several complex details, like, for example, Dr. Brewer's and Knight's procedures that explained how they merged the subject's human epithelial cell samples with a certain concentrated chlorophyll extract that they'd cooked up in the basement. These procedures were followed by even more technical observations describing green hues appearing in cell clusters, extract agitation, illumination, and incubation. I knew that I was going to need so much more than what I'd learned, or should I say nodded through, in Miss Johnson's 8th grade biology class to decode some of this stuff. However, what I did understand were the notes that Knight had written all over the entry, so I just put them together in a story-like format to make it easier for, I guess, me and you to digest, while simplifying, interpreting, or leaving out the more complex parts. With that said, if this isn't enough, I may still release the full unaltered documents sometime in the future. One other thing that I wanted to talk about was the mystery research assistant named Mr. S. Knight. He signed all of the entries that he penned using these initials, and I couldn't find his full government name. I tried looking into the individuals that lived in Dark Falls in 1963 who had the same initials. There were a couple of them, but I was able to narrow it down to 3 men. They were either Sebastian Knight, Stephen Knight, or Smith Knight. However, even with these names, I was still not able to dig up anything useful that could help me identify Dr. Brewer's research assistant or his family, because I wasn't sure if he was even still alive, to be honest. These 3 men lived incredibly vague lives with extremely sparse records of their movements, and I wasn't sure which one of them was the S. Knight that I was looking for, or even if Dr. Brewer's actual research assistant was one of the other S. Knights that I might have overlooked. These research entries were all that was left of S. Knight, as everything else was a complete dead end. So, with no other options, I decided to move on to the next detailed research entry that was penned on April 19 of that same year. S. Knight had written several more records documenting the early phases of Stage 2 that occurred over the previous 2 weeks. These documents contained the same intricate procedures and objectives that were, for me, too difficult to follow and really understand, so I skimmed through most of these records until I came across the final Stage 2 entry. This particular entry was written on day 15, and it explained the results of their experiments. And it goes like this. April 19, 1963, 11:37 a.m. Experiment ID B-024. The title is Botanical Transmutation and Cross-Organism Assimilation, Stage 2. Objective is exploring the feasibility of human tissue consolidation during the embryonic stages, building upon prior test results under revised laboratory frameworks and controlled variables. Research entry day number 15. It worked. Dr. Brewer's brilliant plan was all coming together now. I was a bit worried during the initial stages of the experiment because Dr. Brewer had chosen to act as the primary human subject moving forward. There were no telling what side effects that he might suffer, and I strongly urged him to reconsider, but he had already steeled his resolve. He was ready to put his body on the line, insisting this was a risk that he was willing to take to ensure the success of our Stage 2 experiments. It was a gamble that definitely paid off, because Dr. Brewer appeared to have achieved the impossible by reaching some degree of cellular compatibility with the mutated botanical specimens. The side effects were extreme and significant, which changed him in ways that we did not expect. We couldn't risk external observation, particularly from Dr. Brewer's family, so we began taking measures to keep these effects hidden, like locking the basement door with a padlock and using articles of clothing to conceal the more visible changes from his kids. We managed to keep these changes hidden for some time as we carried out a few more experiments, but despite our efforts to conceal them, we weren't able to stop Margaret and Casey from finding out. It all started with Mrs. Brewer's call to Margaret one Saturday afternoon, telling her daughter that she had to remain in Tucson for a few more days since her Aunt Eleanor's operation hadn't gone so well. I was at the house during the call. I just left the basement to get some water, and I could hear Margaret telling her mother all about the bizarre botany experiments that we'd been carrying out in the basement. She then mentioned that her father was now constantly wearing a baseball cap whenever he wasn't working in the basement, and how she found that to be extremely strange. We knew that it'd be very hard to keep everything completely hidden from the kids. They were very curious children after all. But we needed their relationship with their father to remain normal because we didn't want to frighten them with things that they couldn't understand. I had hoped that Margaret wouldn't uncover anything else, but unfortunately, she had seen her dad consuming his new diet right after the call with her mother was over. From the perplexed look on her face, I'm sure she was wondering why Dr. Brewer was scarfing down plant food from a plastic bag. I later overheard Margaret telling her brother, Casey, what she saw, but he didn't believe her. The secret quickly began to fall apart after that, and everything was revealed a couple of days later when the kids were playing outside with their frisbee like they often did. Dr. Brewer was sitting outside watching them when the children's frisbee unintentionally flew into him and knocked his hat off after a wayward throw. There was a deafening silence as the kids stared in horror at the bright green leaves now growing out of their father's head. In an attempt to handle the situation, Dr. Brewer calmly picked up his hat before taking his kids inside and explaining to them that the leaves were just a small side effect of our experiments. He then assured them that he was completely fine and still the same loving father they'd always known. It took a while to calm the children, but Dr. Brewer tried his best to lift their spirits before going back to the basement for more tests. I decided to stay out of their family matters because I didn't want to complicate things, but I later learned that Margaret, who had been spying on her father while he was changing the bandages from his wound, had now seen Dr. Brewer's green blood. She'd also found out about the bugs and the copious amount of muddy soil that Dr. Brewer packed into his bed before he slept. Dr. Brewer's children had basically uncovered everything at this point, and Margaret now looked completely terrified whenever she saw her father. This was one of the reasons that we tried to keep Dr. Brewer's changes discreet, because there's really no way to explain to a child how her father's blood had turned from red to green in just a matter of a few short weeks. Dr. Brewer knew that there'd be a high price to pay, but even I don't think he realized that traumatizing his children would be one of them. Dr. Brewer and I did what we did in the name of science, to immortalize ourselves in the realms of botany and biology, to discover new spheres of knowledge and science that were once thought impossible. There was no going back now, and all we could do was hope that his children would one day understand. Signed, S. Knight, Research Assistant, reviewed by Dr. Michael Brewer. Well, it became pretty clear to me after reading Knight's 15th research entry that these two botanists were insane individuals who were willing to do anything to reach their goals. Even though I'd been reading these documents, I still wasn't sure what those goals were, though. Knight mentioned something about one of their desired results being regenerative breakthroughs in a small footnote detailing Stage 2's early stages, but their overall objective remained vague. Whatever it was, though, it seemed like they were maybe trying to hide their true aim. And even though I hadn't read Knight's final entry yet, I could tell that they didn't achieve it, because despite his insane rant at the end here about how they would be immortalized, nobody knows who they are today. So, I'm assuming something had gone terribly wrong, and their dreams of this scientific greatness all went down the toilet. The last entry, written by S. Knight, was recorded on May 9, of that same year, of course, about 20 days after the one that I just read. S. Knight started the document the way he always does. May 9, 1963, 3:05 a.m. Experiment ID C-057. The title is Catastrophic Aberration and the Development of a Rogue Uncontrolled Botanical Specimen, Stage 3. The objective is listed as such: assessing the immediate containment or destruction of a sentient, unrestrained specimen exhibiting behavioral abnormalities before suspending further experiments or observations pending review and clearance. Research entry day number 35. He goes on to say this: how did it come to this? I never expected that what Dr. Brewer and I began on the 4th of April would end in such horror and dread. Things began to get out of hand when I learned Dr. Brewer had tried to feed his children a strange green paste that he'd concocted in the basement without my knowledge. He had apparently told Margaret and Casey that he'd prepared them lunch one afternoon, and he urged them to eat it, even after they showed discomfort. He would have forced it down their throats if not for the lucky arrival of Dr. Martinez, who was Michael's former boss. This unsuspected visit allowed the children to throw away the food while telling their father that they'd eaten it out of just pure fear. I tried to stay out of it, once again, as this was a family matter, but Dr. Brewer's children were now completely terrified of him, and this fear grew to new heights when they discovered Dr. Martinez had never left the basement after his visit. Dr. Martinez had come to talk about the experiments that we were working on. Before the conversation could begin, Dr. Brewer told me that he'd like to have their discussion alone. So, I gave the two men some space, and I went home. I later discovered that the children never saw Dr. Martinez leave that night and had found his clothes hidden away in the basement. They'd apparently snuck in through the unlocked door when their father went to help a neighbor install a new sink in the bathroom, and they were horrified at what their father could have done to his former boss. It was at this point that Margaret and Casey tried looking around to see if Dr. Martinez was still there, but they heard their father's footsteps and they were caught while trying to escape through the basement's small window. Dr. Brewer then told his children that he had a perfect explanation for Dr. Martinez's suit. He then calmly explained that Dr. Martinez had taken off his clothes because of the basement's humid atmosphere that his mutated plants had created. They then had their conversation, and Dr. Martinez accidentally left it there before going home. It was a feasible explanation, but his children didn't buy it because they knew he was hiding something. Dr. Brewer then reminded them not to enter the basement again before going back to finishing helping his neighbor install the bathroom sink. Later that evening, I received a call from Dr. Brewer telling me that his wife was coming back from Tucson the next morning and that we should pause our experiments for some time. The man speaking on the phone didn't sound like the Dr. Brewer that I knew, though, because he wouldn't stop when we were so close to a breakthrough. I asked why he decided this, but he just hung up the phone. I was confused, but I decided to talk to him in person after he'd returned from the airport. However, when I made my way to Dr. Brewer's house that afternoon, I witnessed something that I will never forget. Margaret and her friend Diane were riding their bikes a couple of minutes before I arrived, and when they came back home, Casey told them that it was a good day to fly a kite. The kids agreed, however, the kites were in the basement, so they all decided to go down together and quickly grab them. They broke into the basement after getting through the lock and then began to search for their kites, but the only thing they found was the rest of Dr. Martinez's clothes because Margaret noticed his shoes and his pants. The clothes confirmed what they had been dreading, as they now knew their father had lied to them. In the minutes that followed, the kids heard noises coming from a supply closet. As they traced the sounds, they saw several morbid and deformed plant-human hybrids. These plant-like creatures weren't moving, but they bore human parts, like faces and limbs. The children could also hear them moaning as they passed by. It was a truly terrifying sight for them. But Margaret continued to follow the sounds to the supply closet, and when she opened it, she saw a man who looked exactly like her father, restrained with long green tendrils. There was an eerie silence in the basement for a few seconds, as Margaret had seen her father leave the house that morning to pick up their mom at the airport. But despite their initial confusion, they released him from his constraints. The man, now emerging from the supply closet that looked exactly like their father, told the kids that he was their real father, and that the thing that went to get their mother from the airport was an uncontrolled hybrid plant clone from his experiments that had gained sentience and tried to take over his life. Dr. Brewer picked up an old axe and waited patiently for his rogue experiment to arrive. It wasn't long before Dr. Brewer's plant clone returned and attempted to turn the children against their own father by telling them that he was their real father and that the man they'd freed was lying to them. It was, to say the least, a tense situation because the kids now didn't know what to do. But when the man they'd freed called Margaret Princess, she knew that was her real father. She had in that moment realized that the father that they had been communicating with over the last couple of weeks never called her princess the way her dad normally does. She then made sure, by using a knife, to perforate her father's skin, revealing red blood. They figured out who their real father was, and with no hesitation, Dr. Brewer brought his axe down on his clone, tearing him right down the middle in two, spilling green blood and stem guts everywhere. It was at this point I had arrived, and I never thought I'd utter these words, but I witnessed the man that I'd looked up to decapitating himself with my very own eyes. It took me a few minutes to recover from the gruesome sight that I'd seen. Even after destroying the clone, the kids could still hear muffled screams and noises coming from another supply closet deeper in the basement. So they traced the sounds with their father to the second supply closet, where they found Dr. Martinez, and then they freed him. It was all over. And after a week had passed, Dr. Martinez called me and said that even though we'd given everything to these experiments, they'd nearly cost him his life and the lives of his loved ones, so he was shutting it down for good. We then gathered all the mutated specimens that we'd created, and we burned most of them in the backyard. As the green bloods were reduced to ash, Dr. Brewer planted the remaining plants that hadn't mutated in the garden, and he assured both Casey and Margaret that he would never carry out another experiment again. I then bid my goodbye to Dr. Brewer, but before I left, Margaret told me something disturbing. She said one of the flowers that Dr. Brewer had planted from his lab had reached down and touched her ankle. She then said that when she tried to get a closer look, the flower started speaking, murmuring words about how it was her real father and how she should help him. I couldn't tell if she was lying or if this was just some, trauma from everything that had happened, but I told her everything would be fine, and then I went home. That was my last day as Dr. Brewer's research assistant. Our experiments had ended in chaos, but I still finished and kept these detailed entries as a warning to anyone who may one day try to replicate Dr. Brewer's work. It's all over now, but a part of me is still in that lab. I haven't been able to sleep right ever since because I keep having these nagging thoughts that make me wonder if I too was replaced by a mutant plant clone just like Dr. Brewer. And I just don't know it yet. I've held the knife to my palm on several occasions, wondering if I should check whether the blood that flows in my veins is still red or if it's now green, but I've never had the courage to do it. The whole ordeal has made me so paranoid that I'm even scared to scratch myself or to go to the hospital to get my blood drawn. I really tried to move on, but despite hours of therapy, I know this is something that I'll live with for the rest of my life. Signed, S. Knight, Dr. Brewer's former research assistant. Whew. So, I knew the case was over after I'd finished Knight's final entry, but I kept thinking about it for some time. This is one of the more unique Dark Falls cases because it leaned heavily into science rather than, I guess, the usual supernatural cases that I'd been covering. That said, I wasn't sure if any of this actually happened, because the crazy details were pretty much pseudoscience and bordering on science fiction. I'd looked into a few terms myself, for example, like self-directed cellular replication and autonomous cell proliferation within the mutated specimen's callus tissue. Jesus, like typing that out is hard, imagine saying it. Which Knight had used to explain why the clone had gone rogue, but I just ended up even more confused. I wanted to send the documents to actual scientists, but I was scared that they might throw me into the loony bin. There was a huge part of me that believed it all happened since stranger things have happened in the crazy town of Dark Falls. However, there was also a small part of me that believed Knight and Dr. Brewer had accidentally been huffing some mutated weed that they'd concocted, which led them to hallucinate the whole thing and create those entries. That said, if these experiments were real, I couldn't help but think about the million-dollar ideas that I was holding in my very hands. Now, just hear me out. First of all, talking flowers would be a hit on Valentine's Day. Because, I can imagine giving my girlfriend, if I have one on Valentine's Day, little mini flowers of me that could constantly tell her how much I loved her. And not only that, dude, but the hybrid plant clones were even better, because I could send those guys to the hell on earth that is the DMV whenever I need to renew my license. Think about it. These green-blooded twins could free up so much time for me to do more important things, like thinking about Billy's Pokemon religion, or finally finishing that one fanfic that I'd started about a Democrat and a Republican in the Senate who've fallen madly in love with each other, but are doomed to walk their lives on different paths. Sure, I'd eventually have to deal with the mutated hybrid thing trying to take over my life. But I'm sure we could work it out, over a beer or something. Or I could easily take a page out of Dr. Brewer's book and just automate the process by tossing him into a wood chipper. Jokes aside, I was glad that I finally got to the bottom of the Dr. Brewer case. And as I began my next investigation into this bizarre town, I started to wonder what kind of insane details the next Dark Falls case held in store for me. Hey. Yeah, I'm talking to you. You're awesome. You made it to the end, dude. This is amazing. I'm glad we're here together. Hey, listen, the coolest thing you can do beyond making it this far is watching another episode right now. If you watch 2 of my videos back to back, it does crazy things for the algorithm. So try it out. Bye.
Uncovering Dark Falls is written by David Caleb and Dr. Plague. Created, produced, and narrated by Derek Weber.